You in 2023 versus the past. Thanks to the technological advances of the modern age, in 2023, life is pretty safe. In the past, however, many of the things we take for granted now were likely a death sentence for our ancestors. Amputations. In 2023, if you need to get an amputation, then it's usually a fairly safe procedure and performed by highly skilled surgeons. Pumped with anesthesia and put to sleep, an amputee nowadays never has to witness their own dismemberment. But from the first recorded amputation 31,000 years ago in Borneo until the early 20th century, if you had a serious infection or injury that required amputation, the experience was brutally different. With perhaps only a little opium or alcohol to slightly numb the excruciating pain, a typical procedure in the 17th century would start with the patient being fully awake. What followed was a wrestling match between the surgeon's helpers and the patient, as the individual was grappled onto the bed and desperately told to keep still. The surgeon began by making 2 deep incisions with a sharp knife, upon which the patient started to scream in agony. Then another knife was used to cut down the flesh until it reached the periosteum layer, the membranous tissue that covers the bone. This was scraped off in preparation for the most traumatic stage of the operation. Making sure to have a spare on hand in case it broke, an implement was next used to saw off the bone, with the man tasked with handling the limb focusing on holding it steady in order to stop it from snapping completely off. Once the bone was fully dismembered, the stump was either cauterized or stitched up. If the surgical procedure didn't kill you, the bacteria from unwashed, rusty instruments usually caused an accompanying infection that would finish you off afterwards. Vaccinations. In 2023, the perfection of the vaccination process has helped protect us from nasty pathogens and ghastly diseases. But in the past, early misguided attempts to inoculate against awful sickness often had disastrous consequences. During the American Civil War, although Union and Confederate soldiers fought to the death, they did have one common enemy. According to the most recent estimates, disease killed 2 out of every 3 combatants, with smallpox being among the most lethal maladies and reportedly leading to the deaths of 40% of Union soldiers who contracted it. The most common method by which doctors procured vaccinations was to infect small children with cowpox, a closely related and less dangerous form of smallpox. Take fluid from a developing cowpox pustule and then directly inject it into the bloodstream of a soldier. Widespread vaccination, however, was impossible because of the scarcity of doctors who knew how to carry out this delicate procedure, with 1 doctor for every 324 Confederate soldiers and every 133 Union troops. As a result, combatants began to inoculate themselves, using rusty pocket knives and nails to make self-inflicted wounds before piercing a comrade's pustule and coating their gash with the fluids that seeped out. Such a method did more harm than good, for as well as catching any infections from the unsterilized points they had stabbed themselves with, many soldiers mistook the smallpox carbuncles that they hoped would safeguard them from syphilis blisters, accidentally contaminating themselves with an illness which, left untreated, could lead to paralysis, blindness, heart disease, and death. Travel. In 2023, we have the luxury of traveling incredibly long distances in a very short amount of time, in comfort. But in the past, if you wanted to do the same thing, you might not survive the journey or even the destination. Today, excluding stopovers, it takes an average of 20 hours to travel from Edinburgh Airport to Panama and return. But for a group of intrepid Scottish adventurers at the end of the 17th century, this same journey was a lot longer and a lot less pleasant. In 1693, after establishing the Company of Scotland trading to Africa and the Indies, successful businessman William Patterson proposed that the Scottish should colonize the Isthmus of Panama and set up a trading post. Envisioning that their nation could financially benefit by becoming intermediaries of Atlantic and Pacific trade, 1,200 Scots dreaming of a better life on distant shores set sail from Leith Harbor in Edinburgh on July 12, 1698. Arriving at the Bay of Darien in November 1698, many on board had already died or were already sick by the time the group had disembarked. 7 months later, tropical diseases had killed 400 of the colonists, while the rest of the expeditionary force were stricken with yellow fever and were so weak they could barely move. With the fate of the first wave unknown, a second voyage was sent out, and by the time it reached the cursed settlement, 160 people had already succumbed to illness en route. The new arrivals quickly realized they had stumbled into a nightmare, and soon 16 people a day were dying. The remnants were rescued 4 months later, but the journey home would also prove fatal, with shipwrecks and disease killing a further 340 survivors. By the end, only 1 ship returned to Leith, and 2,000 people had perished. Winter. For most of us in 2023 who live in warm and insulated homes, winter is a season of only mild discomfort. While those enchanted by snowy landscapes or Christmas merrymaking even consider it the best season of all. In the past, though, winter was definitely everyone's least favorite time. For the majority of our ancestors, the festive period was instead symbolically associated with old age, poverty, and death, who also had the misfortune to experience winters that were often colder and longer. One such occasion was the volcanic winter of 536, when average temperatures dropped by as much as 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit because of a cloud of volcanic ash that darkened the skies for 18 months. In what is generally regarded by historians and scientists alike as the worst year to be alive on record, these unusual climatic conditions, which ushered in widespread global crop failures, caused it to snow in China during summer and created, according to the Roman scholar Cassiodorus, a winter without storms, spring without mildness, and a summer without heat. It's been attributed to the 6th century eruption of a volcano called Ilopango, located in El Salvador, which expelled 10.5 cubic miles of dense rock. This cataclysm was thankfully a one-off event, but for the people of the Middle Ages, global cooling was far more prolonged. The result of a decrease in sunspot activity or further volcanic eruptions, the Little Ice Age lasted from 1300 to 1850 and saw global average temperatures plummet again by as much as 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. In parts of Scandinavia and Switzerland, villages and farms were wiped out by advancing ice glaciers, and in the 17th century, blizzards were recorded as far south as Florida on some occasions. In addition, the 1709 Great Winter in Europe was so cold that thousands of the poorest people died in their sleep of hypothermia, while Paris was completely cut off by snow for 3 months, forcing some people to feast on frozen corpses to survive. Beauty. In 2023, applying cosmetics usually isn't too life-threatening, since they're required by law to go through a strict safety assessment before being allowed to hit the shelves. In the past, however, beauty products often cut short many lives. From as far back as 3500 BC, makeup lined with toxic chemicals such as lead was commonly used by women from all eras of history to whiten their skin, most famously by Queen Elizabeth I. Although prized for its face-smoothing qualities, lead makeup had the unfortunate side effect of making the user uglier as time went on, causing gray hair, dried-out skin, severe abdominal pain, and constipation. But when society cottoned on to the fact that lead was dangerous, an even more poisonous ingredient was found to replace it. Skin whitening products were next made out of arsenic, a chemical that kills red blood cells to create a paler complexion, and which was often nibbled on throughout the day in the form of a wafer. Women who chowed down on it gave themselves a variety of ailments such as nervous system damage, kidney damage, and baldness, which were often the precursors to an agonizing death. In the more enlightened 20th century, fashionistas were still permanently damaging themselves. Among the deadliest fads involved being exposed to X-rays for up to 20 hours in order to remove unwanted hair. Although an effective treatment, patients would later have to deal with a raft of unwanted consequences, including skin thickening, atrophy, ulcerations, baldness, and ultimately, cancer. So, count yourself lucky that you live in 2023, because in the past, you wouldn't last.